Hello and welcome to the first of a two-part webinar series from Hayward as leaders of the industry work to keep customers informed and updated about these new changes and what it means for their businesses. The next webinar will be held on November 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in partnership with Aqua, and we'll be sending out further information about that in the coming months ahead. In the meantime, Hayward has recently launched a dedicated DOE resource center at hayward.com/regulations that's loaded with fact sheets, FAQs, videos, and white papers. It will be updated regularly with key DOE updates, important news, and other useful resources. There are a few important notes for those who are not used to webinars, which you see at the bottom of your screen there. You don't need to enable video or have access to a webcam. You should be hearing easily the audio that's being presented. And as I'll mention a few times, if you have questions, which is very likely as we're covering a complicated topic, there's a panel on your right that allows you to post questions, and we'll get into those at the end of the webinar. You can also get in touch directly with experts at Hayward for any other outstanding questions you may have regarding these new pool pump regulations at doeregulations@hayward.com. I wanted to introduce myself. My name's Scott Webb, and I'm the executive editor at Aqua Magazine. I've had a long history with our expert today, Scott Petty. He's one of the smartest people I know in the industry, and he understands this better than anybody else in the country. And so I'm going to turn it over to him, and we'll get started learning about the changes that are coming in July of next year, which will really be the most significant changes that we've had, certainly in pumps, in many years. So Scott, if you're ready, we'll get started.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those on the West Coast. Thanks to Scott and the Aqua team, the Hayward sales and marketing team for getting the message out, but certainly, most importantly, our trade professional partners for joining. I know federal government regulations are not the most exciting topic, but as Scott Webb mentioned, this is the single biggest change to pumps, and really one of the biggest changes in the industry since VGB, and you could probably argue this is even more broader reaching from that. So we're going to go through really brief, how we got to where we are, but more importantly, what it's going to mean for all of us. Manufacturers, distributors, builders, servicers, retailers, ultimately the consumer. Before doing that, though, we'd be remiss, given the current situation, not to speak about the COVID-19. It's impacting all of us, personally and professionally. So just know that we're committed to do what's best for our customers, our employees, and the public. We're all in this together. So certainly that's that's top of mind for a lot of us, if not all of us, at this moment. So it may be hard to think about what's coming in July of next year. But we appreciate taking the time to learn that. Should you have any specific questions or issues as it relates to what's happening now, certainly contact your Hayward sales representative. But with that said, I do want to give you this is a high-level overview, and then we'll go through in a little bit more detail. First, just to make sure it's clear, we're talking about the U.S. Department of Energy. You'll see that acronym a lot, DOE, Department of Energy. This is a U.S.-based regulation. I'll probably talk a little bit later about international. This applies just to the U.S., but there'll likely be some direct or at least indirect impact to other markets, given just the sheer size of the U.S. market. But what we're talking about is U.S. It's federal and it's mandatory, and it impacts all pumps at least as defined, which I'll talk about, but it covers in-ground, above-ground, residential, commercial, up to, there is an upper limit in terms of scope. I'll go through that in more detail. This is similar to some of the other state regulations that you may be familiar with, such as California's Title 20, Arizona Title 44, Florida with, using APSB 15. This is similar but different, and more importantly, it supersedes any state regulation. So once this goes into effect, at least the technical requirements go into effect in July of 2021, it will override, for lack of a better word, anything at the state level. You'll hear me use this date a lot, July 19th, 2021. It's important to note, and again, you'll hear me say this multiple times, that is based off the date the pump is manufactured, not sold or shipped, which is an important distinction. And ultimately, it means that no one in the channel has to return any product. So it's not like you have to go check your inventory on July 20th and look for what's DOE compliant, what's not. Anything that's made beforehand could sit on our shelves, distributor shelves, your shelves. It could be sold at any point as long as it was made before that date. Smaller, one of probably the biggest points of confusion as it relates to this is a thought that, well, all single speed pumps go away. It's nothing but variable speed. That's not the case. Now, there certainly are going to be more variable speed pumps and less single speed, but there will be still single speed pumps, smaller ones, but they will meet the DOE requirements and still be allowed. That's on the in-ground side. On the above ground and pressure cleaner booster pumps and a few other categories we'll cover, really not too much changes, so that the takeaway is that most of those will remain single speed. Even the way we refer to these pumps are going to change. Instead of what's technically called nominal horsepower, but we've been calling pumps by the horsepower, half horsepower, 3/4 horsepower, or 1 horsepower for decades. And all that goes away in that we have to refer to everything based off total horsepower. So it eliminates all the max rates to full rates that we do, special rates on the above ground, but just the naming convention itself. And then finally, the term you'll also hear a lot in this and going forward is the metric of energy efficiency called weighted energy factor, WEF, not WTF, WEF. And it's very comparable to vehicles miles per gallon. So you'll be hearing a lot about WEF. What is WEF? So being the government, it wouldn't be a government without some more acronyms that we all have to get used to. This first one, actually, the trade doesn't really have to know, but I use it later in the presentation because it's important for manufacturers. That is this top one here, hydraulic horsepower. It's not the same as motor horsepower. I think they use horsepower just to confuse us, but it's directly proportional to pump head and flow. That's how the DOE uses, that's the metric DOE uses to size pumps, as opposed to the motor horsepower that we use in the pool industry. It's not going to be labeled on the product, but it's a basis for the measurement that we're going to be talking about later. There's the weighted energy factor metric I talked about. For those that really want to know, it's based off flow divided by power consumption. Takeaway is that a higher number is better. It's basically your bang for your buck, and light miles per gallon, the bigger number is better. And it's how you can compare. All things equal, you can compare two pumps and say, if this has a higher WEF, it is going to be more energy efficient. This will be labeled on the product on or before July 2021. So this regulation covers a lot of ground, and it's easy to kind of get lost in the details, in the weeds, if you will. But to kind of step back and understand, this regulation, that the technical name for it is, again, another acronym, Dedicated Purpose Pool Pumps, DPPP. So anything defined as a dedicated purpose pool pump is within this scope. It's important to note, I don't think I said before, this applies to anything sold into the United States. So it doesn't matter where it's made. If it's made domestically or international, it has to meet this regulation. And it was, I don't have a slide on it, but I'll speak to briefly that this was a negotiated rulemaking. The industry, manufacturers, energy utilities, energy advocates, we worked with the DOE to develop this regulation. Like many negotiations, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we at least had a seat at the table. And so as an industry, we wanted to have basically product within this regulation, because if a product does not fall in this regulation, it's likely it would fall into some other general pump regulation. The DOE already regulates a lot of other industrial and commercial pumps. So there's a lot of different types of pumps within this regulation, which I'll talk about. This is one way to slice it, and that is single phase versus three phase. And I point out that distinction because depending on the category, there are sometimes performance requirements that manufacturers have to meet, and then sometimes there aren't. It's just part of this regulation, so it's not shoehorned into some other regulation. So on this slide, kind of working actually right to left, three-phase is part of the regulation. Three-phase pumps are part of the regulation, but there are no performance requirements. So the punchline is that basically three-phase pumps don't have to change. They can remain single speed. Certainly you can connect a variable frequency drive to a pump and have the benefits of energy savings, but you don't have to per this regulation. Of course, the bulk of the industry is on single phase. We broke that up into two categories. Basically, there's an upper limit, anything above 2.5 hydraulic horsepower, which again is not the same thing as motor horsepower, but it's roughly 5 motor horsepower. So the idea is if you got a really large single phase pump, there's no performance requirements for it because those are generally going to be used for commercial applications, and there's just not that many that could justify necessarily having to go to variable speed. But probably 95% of the market, or 90%, is in this category here. So this is basically everything else, and there are minimum performance requirements. So that's where I'm going to be spending the bulk of the time because that's where the biggest changes are. Another important distinction that the DOE, we learned this early on in the negotiations, the meetings, is that the DOE, they won't create what's called equipment classes. Basically, they won't regulate based off application because their argument is basically rightfully that they're not in the backyard. So from a regulation standpoint, there's actually no distinction between in-ground or above ground. There's no difference between residential and commercial. It has to be based off some sort of physical parameter or characteristic that can be measured and quantified before it leaves the manufacturer. So ultimately what we settled on were first the characteristic of priming. So if you go home and read this 500-page regulation, like I'm sure we all do in our spare time, a great cure for insomnia if anyone has that. But the high level is that instead of, you won't hear the term in-ground, you'll see the term self-priming. Kind of by definition, all in-ground pumps are self-priming. We did split that into two categories, called small and large, real high level there. I'll talk a bit more about that later and why that was important to break that out. Most above ground are non-self-priming, not all, but again, probably 90-95%. So there's a different criteria for non-self-priming. There's criteria for pressure cleaner booster pumps. These are the categories I'm going to focus on the most, since those are the products Hayward makes. But just note there at the bottom that there are also other categories included in this regulation. The official term of integral sand filter pool pump or integral cartridge filter pool pump. Those are your quote unquote Intex type pools. Those have a prescriptive requirement, which states it has to have a pump timer, basically, so the pump doesn't run 24 hours a day. But otherwise, not much changes. And then technically, spa pumps, storable, electric, and rigid are included. But again, there's no performance requirements. So it's important to note that things may be in the regulation, but that doesn't mean that there's requirements or that really anything changes for it. So
Scott, I wanted to ask you, it sounds like you had to sit down with a group of people and try to come up with a way to regulate pool pumps with lots of different interests at a committee table. And the only thing I can think of is the patience of Job that must have been required to do that. But the whole idea of regulating pool pumps in the beginning, that started with the government, correct?
it did. The history of that kind of dates back 10 plus years ago with California Title 20 requiring energy efficient pumps. Then in 2013, Energy Star developed, which is a voluntary program and still continues. I'll actually speak about that later. And as the government was regulating, I mentioned earlier, the commercial and industrial pumps, they recognized there was this kind of unique segment of pool pumps and ultimately decided to kind of carve out a separate regulation for that. So yes, it did start with the government ultimately at a state level, but worked its way up to a federal. And then it was a back and forth negotiation, a lot of meetings up in DC, a lot of back and forth on just how to create this, at least on this aspect of how to create. We had to educate the DOE on the pool industry, and then we had to align on what the criteria were. This part was pretty straightforward. It was time consuming, but ultimately it was working together to get to information. When I show later when we actually had to draw the lines in the sand on what the requirements were going to be, that's where the challenges came in.
Right. Okay.
So again, this is still in that data gathering point. So this is what this is showing is data that was provided by manufacturers. So it's most manufacturers you're probably familiar with in the industry. We provided data to the DOE. And so this chart is showing, this is that hydraulic horsepower I talked about. So basically flow, larger pumps, smaller pumps. And then the WEF, the weighted energy factor. And then these are color coded so that your blue dots are single speed, your red dots are 2-speed, and your green dots are variable speed. And this just visually shows what I think a lot of us know, that all things equal, a variable speed pump is going to be more efficient than a 2-speed pump, which is going to be more efficient than a single speed pump. And that's because of the benefits of running a pump at lower speed, what's called the pump affinity law. So this aligns with kind of a good, better, best scenario. So this was, everything up to this point was really data collection standpoint. But then the real rubber hit the road, which is where we had to draw the proverbial lines in the sand. So that's what this slide is. This is an important slide. Not that I expect anyone to print this chart out and put it on their wall at home. But the impact of what this is. So this is that same data, but now with the requirements drawn. And so I mentioned before that we broke up, this is, by the way, for self-priming, AKA in-ground pumps. So we decided earlier that we wanted to separate, I'll just refer to it as in-ground, it's a lot easier that way, as in-ground pumps as small versus large. And that's because we didn't want to have a one-size-fits-all requirement. At some point, when you get to smaller in-ground pumps, it just doesn't make sense. There's not as much energy to be saved. And the DOE their primary goal was up here to reduce the number of large single-speed pumps that consume a lot of energy. 3-horsepower single-speed pump consumes a lot of power. So that's actually what this vertical dotted line here is. There's an actual number associated with it, 0.711 hydraulic horsepower. I don't remember how we got exactly to that number, but that is a distinction between quote unquote small and large. The takeaway is that anything to the right of that dotted line, the efficiency, the weighted energy factor has to be above this solid black line. Anything to the left of that dotted line, the weighted energy factor has to be above that blue line. And clearly those lines are rather different in their criteria. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time about what does that mean. I'll say that the regulation, actually it's important to note, the regulation doesn't actually say, thou shalt use variable speed pumps. The DOE set this weighted energy factor requirement. They don't care how manufacturers get there. If we put a flux capacitor inside the pump, we're good. So if we can do that, we'll let you know. But it allows manufacturers or encourages manufacturers to continue to innovate, to develop, however we get there. But at the end of the day, the line was drawn so that you can see the green dots, the variable speeds, can meet the requirements. 2 speeds and single speeds don't. Now, some 2 speeds, like that red dot right there, is pretty close, and we might be able to get it across the line with some product changes. But blue dot, single speed, there's just no way to get it above that line based off the laws of physics, at least that we know of. So the takeaway is that things on this side of the curve, based off today's technology, basically will have to be variable speed. If we can get there through other means, we'll certainly look at that as manufacturers. But a single speed just can't get there. A 2-speed, difficult. However, on this side of the curve, the blue line, you can see how much it drops here. Still, some of these single speeds don't meet it. But again, we as manufacturers have an opportunity and are doing this. I'm going to speak to what Hayward is doing. If we have a pump here that's just below the line, we can look at and are looking at what we could do to get it above the line. So it may be a little bit better motor. It could be a different impeller, diffuser, etc. So again, it's important to note that there's distinctly different criteria depending on the size of the pump.
Just to reiterate there, Scott.
Oh, go. Yes.
Just kind of clarify for me, below that 0.711 hydraulic horsepower, there's still going to be a number of single speed pumps that will meet the criteria and will be allowable after the change next year, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. That makes it clear that that's how we're able to still have single speed pumps that meet the regulation, because it can be above that blue line, which dovetails perfectly. That was a nice segue to it impacts pumps differently. And that's one of the other biggest changes with this compared to, say, a California Title 20, which is based off the horsepower of the pump, the motor horsepower, which again is what we've all thought about for decades. This regulation, the x-axis here, if you will, it's based off flow. Not all pumps of the same horsepower have the same flow. So, keeping my Hayward hat on, a 1 horsepower TriStar is on this side of the curve. It's, don't hold me to it, but it's one of these blue dots over here. That's because it's a high performance pump and it generates more flow. However, a 1 horsepower super pump, because it's a medium head pump, doesn't have as much flow, it's on this side of the curve. So the takeaway there is that a 1 horsepower TriStar can't meet the regulation. However, a 1 horsepower super pump will. So one of the other understandable comments I've heard is that, okay, this regulation is like California, where anything above 1 horsepower has to be variable speed. Well, no, that's not the case, in that it's not based off motor horsepower. And ultimately, It impacts every pump differently, and by extension, it's going to impact every customer differently, every region differently. This industry is very regional. So if you're a super pump customer, we're all going to be impacted by the DOE regulation, but the amount basically depends on what you're using or will be using. If you're using super pump, your world's going to change because, as I'll show you on the next slide, anything above 1 horsepower won't meet the requirement, but you'll still be able to use the 1 horsepower super pumps, which, we're thankful there's a lot of those out there. But for those of you in California, I know, don't use a lot of super pumps. You may be using TriStars. Not as many of those will be single speed. So it really does depend on what types of pumps you're using, what types of pools you're building. So this slide is while not the most exciting because it's a chart, it has far-reaching implications in terms of what manufacturers are allowed to build and ultimately what the trade's able to use and how it's going to impact every pump and every customer to some degree differently. With that said, as we said at the beginning, there are going to be less SKUs. So ultimately, I think this is a good thing. I'm sure our distribution friends will be happy because, as manufacturers, we have a lot of pump SKUs, models. A lot of that is simply because of the max rate, full rate preference within this industry. And I have a slide about that later, but that goes away. So having the same product but with different horsepower ratings, that won't be allowed. So that in and of itself gets rid of a lot of SKUs. And then of course, the single speed pumps that, or any pump that doesn't meet the requirement, can't be made after July 2021. So there's going to be less models, less SKUs that Hayward and other manufacturers make. Ultimately, that can be a good thing, is that it reduces customer confusion, reduces stocking levels, etc. So most everything I've talked about has been fairly general or common and applies to all manufacturers. And as an industry, we're wanting to get this message out through PHTA, et cetera, through Aqua. But ultimately, we as Hayward want to communicate what does this mean specifically for Hayward product, for our Hayward customers. So this is a list. It's a one slide abbreviated list of SKUs that will meet the requirement and will not. We're going to publish a more formal list with the actual part numbers that you can look up. This is just a way to get everything on one slide. But just to give you a high-level overview of what that means, anything in this box here, we, Hayward, will still be able to make after July 2021. So all of our variable speeds, both are in-ground and above ground. Super pump, like I mentioned, because it's on the left side of that curve, that dotted line, any 1 horsepower and smaller, so half, 3/4, 1 horsepower, we'll still be able to make those as single-speed pumps. And again, that's been one of the biggest areas of confusion and misunderstanding. They will still be allowed. Same thing as to do that, though, we are going to have to make some product changes. For instance, super pump, we're having to go to a 2-inch housing, probably change the impeller diffuser. But we have already identified a way to get it above that line so that we can still sell it. Maxflow XL, same type thing, 1.5 horsepower and smaller. But once you move to those larger pumps, because they're more flow, you have less opportunity to meet those requirements. So in our TriStar, it's actually the bookends, our 1/2 horsepower full rate and our 5 horsepower full rate, because that one's actually so large it's outside of the performance requirement scope. All of our 3-phase models, because there are no performance requirements. All of our booster pumps meet the requirements. On the above ground side, PowerFlow Matrix, 1 horsepower and smaller, but on our PowerFlow LX, 1.5 horsepower and smaller. So again, you can see the difference depending on the model. Anything that's not in that middle list is on the can't make it list. So that's all the remaining TriStars, all of our Super 2s. That's an older design that doesn't have the hydraulic efficiency like TriStar. Super pump, 1.5 horsepower and larger, single speeds would not be allowed, and then the 1.5 horsepower PowerFlow Matrix. all of this is subject to change, and obviously as manufacturers, we're going to continue to do whatever we can to get these products compliant, and we'll continue to evolve that as we go forward. So this just reiterates that topic, that concept that not all single speed pumps go away. This regulation absolutely will reduce the number of single speed pumps, but there's some high volume ones, particularly in the eastern part of the U.S., but in other areas as well, such as the 1 horsepower super pump and Maxflow XL. Again, they may require some changes. I don't talk a lot about above ground or pressure cleaner booster pumps in this presentation because really not much changes as it relates to the product. Most will remain single speed. We do have, for instance, variable speed above ground pumps, but the requirement from the regulation is such that we can still make a lot of single speeds. Variable speed, I mean, that is going to become the most common overall, whereas variable speed is certainly the fastest growing, but still overall not the most common type of pump in the industry. It will become the most common going forward. And just to note, Hayward is very well positioned in that. As many of you may already know, we have a lot of different models of variable speed pumps of different sizes based off those different wet ends, the TriStar platform, the Super Pump platform, the MaxFlow, and then different horsepowers. And the same way pool professionals for decades have been sizing pumps to pools based off whatever the pool needs. We do the same thing here. These just have, these are now variable speed. But Hayward has the most efficient variable speed pumps, 1 horsepower and above, per that weighted energy factor metric. So you'll be seeing that data, officially showing how efficient these pumps are. And just to kind of give you an idea of, how that applies, you mentioned before, Scott, the Energy Star. I'll pause just for background again. That Energy Star started in 2013. It's a voluntary standard. So Energy Star is part of the EPA, which is separate from the DOE. A lot of acronyms there, but Energy Star is voluntary. DOE is mandatory. So Energy Star started in 2013, and at that point, 2 speeds of variable speeds could meet it. They updated their requirements in January of last year, such that basically only variable speeds could meet it. But once the DOE regulations go into effect, the EPA, the Energy Star is always the best of the best. And, there's Energy Star refrigerators and computers. Those are meant to be the most energy efficient products within the category. So once the DOE regulations go into effect, Energy Star knows they have to raise the proverbial bar. So they've already published their version 3.0, which goes into effect at the same time as the DOE. And Energy Star 3.0 will basically award for the best of the best variable speed. You can be a variable speed and meet DOE, but not meet Energy Star. All of Hayward variable speed pumps already meet those Energy Star 3.0 requirements. So again, just another way to show how we've given a lot of emphasis on the energy efficiency, and now shown through that WEF metric. Energy Star kind of goes hand in hand with utility rebates. And we have to expect as an industry that with the DOE regulations going into place and basically minimum efficiency requirements, that these utility rebates are going to change. At some point, they may go away, or they may change different criteria. They may award it for Energy Star 3.0. It's the takeaway is that something's probably going to change as it relates to utility rebates. So any areas of the country that already have utility rebates, continue to encourage to promote those, and recognize that they're probably not going to stay as they exist today for the immediate future. It is important, everything I've talked about so far has been all the benefits, and there are a lot of benefits of this. But note there are some unintended consequences of this regulation, because, as I mentioned before, the requirements don't vary by application. So again, difference from, say, California Title 20, those requirements are only for the filtration pump, the circulation pump, the main pump, whatever you want to call it. These requirements, DOE requirements, apply to every pump. Doesn't matter how it's used. So even if that pump is used as a non-filtration or auxiliary, or let's call it a water feature pump, spa booster pump, it's still going to have to meet these requirements. And a lot of the times, especially for water features and spa boosters, kind of by definition or by practice, those should be higher flow, higher horsepower pumps, which are less likely to be single speed. Pretty good odds you could end up with having to put a variable speed pump on a spa booster. Well, there's pros and cons to that. The benefit with a variable speed pump is you can dial in what you want. It's adjustable. You can adjust that visual, that sound, if you got a laminar or a deck jet or something like that. But certainly from an energy efficiency standpoint, you just don't have as much opportunity to save energy there, because water features typically don't run that long, a couple hours a day, a couple hours a week. But that's just the reality of the regulation. It's not just the filtration pump, it's everything. And then there's commercial. Three-phase are excluded, but there's certainly a lot of single-phase pumps on commercial applications, especially semi-commercial like hotel. And not all jurisdictions will allow a pump to run at lower flows. So, we're going to have to work through that with inspectors. As I mentioned before, the naming convention of these pumps just fundamentally changes. So as manufacturers, we're going to have to list pumps with the WEF, the weighted energy factor, and that total horsepower with a service factor of 1. So it changes how these pumps are named and eliminates, you may have heard the terms, max rates or up rates, full rates. We do special rates, all these different rates that we have. All that goes away. We can no longer modify the service factor and in turn change the horsepower. That service factor is fixed at 1.0, and so the total horsepower is dictated. This is, I don't want to say a classic example, but this is an example of a 1 horsepower full rate pump that we call a 1 horsepower, but you can take that exact same pump and change the service factor and now call it a 1.5 horsepower max rate. Both of these pumps going forward in this example would be referred to as a 1.65 total horsepower. So even just what we call these things, we're going to have to get used to. A 1 horsepower super pump is going to be, I believe in that case, a 1.1 total horsepower. But even our fundamental terminology is going to change. For those products that we'll still be able to make, same performance, but it's going to have a new name. So one of the things you'll be seeing from Hayward is basically cheat sheets to kind of keep our naming convention straight, so we're not all confused, particularly when you're replacing products. As it relates to timing, as I've mentioned, but just to emphasize, these regulations are effective July 19th, 2021. Those are based off the date the pump is manufactured, final assembly. So no product has to be returned. I just want to continue to emphasize that. So it's not like the world radically changes immediately on July 19th, 2021. There'll still be product on our shelves and distribution shelves. You can still sell and install product as long as it's available. But at some point, if manufacturers can't keep making it, the channel, distribution, etc., will run out of product that isn't compliant. So use it as long as you can get it. But ultimately, as manufacturers, we have to make product that meets the requirement after that date. We, as manufacturers, bear all the responsibility. There's no DOE police, but if they were to see product in a distributor or a dealer, it would ultimately go back to the manufacturer if it was deemed made after that date. But I just want to remind everybody, I could be guilty of it too, to think, well, 2021, that's next year. Well, that's less than 16 months away now. So it's going to be here before you know it. And we're going to be coming up before too long with the next early buy. We're going to have to start thinking about, as an industry, what do we want to buy to prepare for these changes. So it's going to be here before you know it.
Scott, just to reiterate there, the way this will be controlled is they'll just shut down production of non-compliant pumps on that date. And that's kind of like the controlling mechanism. I know I was wondering, are they going to go into stores and and clear pumps off shelves or anything like that. The way they control it is through stopping the manufacturing, correct?
That's absolutely correct. So nobody's going in and looking what's already on the shelves. It's just as manufacturers, we bear the responsibility. We can't make it after that date if it doesn't meet the requirement.
Gotcha.
It is important to note, this is one of the probably the most common question I get is everything we've talked about today to this point has been about the entire pump, the pump assembly, the plastic, the wet end, and the motor. It does not currently cover the replacement motor. This was identified at the very beginning, but again, per process, DOE won't allow us or won't allow anybody to regulate a finished good and its components. You can't regulate the car and the fuel injector at the same time. So the industry and the DOE are working on similar standards for replacement motors. And the reason for that, from a DOE standpoint, they want to do that to close what would otherwise be an energy savings loophole. If you can't install a 2 horsepower pump, but you can still a 2 horsepower single speed pump, but you can still get a 2 horsepower replacement motor, it defeats the purpose from an energy saving standpoint. So the DOE has vested interest. Obviously, as manufacturers of pumps, we're very keen to be, treated fairly in terms of what could be required, pump versus motor. And then as a pool professional, if you want to install the pump, but the single speed is no longer available, but your competitor is able to or willing to do the motor, then that becomes a challenge. So we want to even the playing field here. The motor regulation it aligns very closely with the pump regulation by intent. Some of the technical criteria have to be different. It can't be based off flow because there is no flow. So this is based off horsepower, but it's very similar. Our goal as an industry and the DOE is to have this go into effect at the same time as the pump regulation, July 19th, 2021, but it's not yet finalized. So know that motor regulation, we strongly believe, is a matter of when, not if. It's a matter of when is that going to be? Is it July 2021 or perhaps some date thereafter? But just note that this is expected to come.
Is the group responsible for getting that motor regulation done? Is that the same people who were doing the pump regulation?
Yes, we had to get the band back together and go through it again. So
right.
Exactly, because it's that important for all of us in the industry to make sure, what that to accomplish the energy savings and then ultimately, be aligned with pump or replacing motors.
Sure.
So I'm going to kind of pivot the last bit here to what probably a lot of you already know, but ultimately, how to sell these variable speed pumps. There's going to be more variable speed pumps and how to sell them. Certainly, first and foremost, the reason we're talking about all this is to save energy. And a lot of people may not realize, especially the homeowner, may not realize the pool pump can be the number 2 consumption of energy in the entire house after HVAC. These pumps can consume a lot of energy. So with a variable speed pump, that's the reason they're there. It goes back to those WEF ratings and all the data and just our experiences in industry that variable speed pumps can save a lot of energy. But as you can imagine, variable speed pumps, they cost more than a single speed pump. So, I'll ask you, Scott, what's the first question you can imagine a customer is going to ask if you start talking to them about a variable speed pump?
It's going to be, how much is this going to set me back, and why is this a good idea for me financially?
Exactly. So how much is it going to cost? I mean, we're all consumers. We all think that way. And especially if they have any experience with, owning a pool, or if it's a replacement and they have an idea of what the pump might be, they kind of have a number in their head. So, if you immediately respond with the purchase price of that pump, you probably dug yourself a hole, because, they're in their mind, they may be thinking pick a number, $500, $600, $700 for a single speed. If you respond with $1,200, $1,500, you kind of already dug yourself a hole. So what we encourage you is as manufacturers is when they ask inevitably how much does it cost. I do it too. As a consumer, I'm guilty of it too. I'm often just thinking about what's the purchase price. But for a lot of things, and particularly products that consume energy, pumps, vehicles, the cost to operate it usually dwarfs the purchase price because of how much energy, in this case, how much energy a single speed pump consumes. So what we encourage is when someone asks you that inevitable question, how much does it cost? Pivot to, well, how much does it cost to own? How much does it cost to operate that single speed pump? So this chart, I love a good chart, so I had to put another one here, but this just shows, I'm not putting absolute numbers here because the absolute numbers depends, how much the single speed pump costs, how much energy it consumes, depends on how long they run it, your length of your season, how much you pay in energy. But it's safe to say in basically every application, the cost to operate a single speed pump over a given period of time, let's say over 5 years, is a lot more than the purchase price because of how much energy these pumps consume. The variable speed, probably maybe even double the price at purchase. And so if you lead off with that, you set yourself back. But the cost to operate that pump is going to be a lot less, and therefore you're going to have a lot of savings over that period of time. That's if you buy the pump brand new outright. In a lot of cases, it's particularly in the aftermarket, it's a case of they had to buy the single speed pump anyway, so it's ultimately the difference between the two. So the adder or the incremental, if you will, is a lot lower. Still costs the same to operate the variable speed pump, and then you have even more savings. So, I encourage you to kind of pivot the mindset to that. To calculate actual savings, you can use on Hayward.com. We have an app as well. You can use our energy calculators. You may also just have a general rule of thumb about how much you may be able to save in your territory based off length of season, number of run hours a day, etc. And energy is important. Saving energy, saving money, but you still have to operate the pool. I mean, the pump uses the least amount of energy when it's off, but unfortunately, you can't turn it off the entire time. That defeats the purpose. So you still have to, run a pump to maintain proper sanitization, to operate your heater if you have that, a suction cleaner, pressure cleaner, booster pump. But that's ultimately what a variable speed pump allows you to do, is adjust to whatever the pool needs. Pool typically doesn't have to run, full steam all the time. That was the challenge with single speed pumps. You had to size it to the most you ever wanted to do. With a variable speed pump, if you just need to circulate and sanitize, you can run it at a lower speed. When you want a water feature or you need to operate a heater, you turn it up. But then when you're done, you can turn it back down. That's where the savings can come in. And at the same time, assure you're still sanitizing the pool and having a clean pool.
That's one of the best graphics that I've seen demonstrating the savings, and I've seen quite a few. I think it makes it the clearest at a glance where your savings are and operation costs. I think that's a really, really convincing graph that you've got there.
Yeah, I think this is exactly. It's a good way to kind of put it all together on one. The impact of owning the pump, not just buying the pump. And in a case of, but wait, there's more. There are other benefits, compelling benefits of running pumps at lower speeds. Energy and saving money, often the most important, but probably a close second. And depending on where you are and how close you are to your neighbors, and the quiet operation is particularly important. Running these pumps at low speeds, it is incredibly quiet compared to a single speed pump running wide open all the time. So you have that benefit as lots continue to get smaller and smaller. A lot of consumers or consumers' neighbors are happy that these pumps don't have to run 100% all the time. And then the other benefits of running at a lower speed, kind of slowing things down, better filtration because you're not blasting, say, in cartridge DE at full speed all the time, less stress on equipment. And then usually you're going to run these pumps longer, a little bit counterintuitive, but instead of running a single speed pump 12 hours a day, which means the water is stagnant the other 12, with a variable speed pump, you can run it in many cases 24 hours a day, but at a low speed, and you're still able to keep the sanitizer, the salt system, or the chlorinator running. One analogy I borrowed from somebody is, it's like having a car with a gas pedal. A single speed pump is like having a car that only goes 100 miles an hour, which sounds like fun, but isn't the best for your engine and not the most fuel efficient. With a variable speed, like I said, you really dial that in. So just kind of takeaways here, just to kind of wrap this up. If you take anything away from what I said, these last two slides really cover it. Again, enforcement starts July 19th, 2021, based off the date manufactured, not sold, don't have to return anything. Requirements do not change based off application, so it means it applies to a filtration pump, water feature pump, spa booster pump, and in turn applies to residential and commercial. But recognize that there are some unique distinctions in that, for instance, three-phase pumps don't have performance requirements. On the in-ground side, aka self-priming, variable speeds will become the most common. And again, a Hayward plug in that we have the most efficient pumps. But also recognize that there will be single-speed pumps that will still be available. For instance, the 1 horsepower super pump and MaxFlow XL. We're going to have to change the name. I'll put it here under in-ground, but actually this applies to everything, going to the total horsepower naming convention. And again, as I've said before, not too much changes product-wise as it relates to above ground and pressure cleaner booster pumps. They'll still remain mostly single speed, at least by the regulation. On the customer side, communicating, the benefits, why they should, want to use this new, often variable speed pump, selling those benefits. It's the lower cost of ownership. The other way of looking at, the total cost of ownership, and it will be lower. You'll save more money with a variable speed pump in most cases. The quiet operation, the other benefits, feel free to borrow it as well. It's like having a car with a gas pedal. As we said, again, no, you don't have to return any product. So from your, immediate business doesn't have to change on July 19th, 2021, but ultimately it will. It's going to level the playing field because this impacts everybody. It doesn't matter how pumps are sold. We all have to meet the same requirements, and especially once the motor regulation goes through. And it's a little bit cliche, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this is a win-win-win scenario. We shouldn't be bashful of the fact that we are, as manufacturers and distributors and dealers, pool professionals, we are selling a more expensive product, the variable speed pumps, and the homeowners are getting benefits. So, we don't have to be, hide to the fact that we're able to make more revenue, more profit with a product that ultimately is going to help the homeowner. And then, it wouldn't be a presentation without some sort of cheesy quote at the end. It is about adapting to this change. And as we said way back at the beginning, this is, not just because I'm the pump guy. This really is one of the biggest changes, if not the biggest change in the pool industry that I can think of in the last 15, 20 years, if not longer. So adapting to that and preparing for it now. The fact that you're listening to this webinar says that you're getting prepared for this. That's going to be coming before you know it. I'll close out just again a reminder that Hayward does have a website up and running, hayward.com/regulations. You can get a lot of information, fact sheets, FAQs, videos. I believe this video will be posted on there. More information as we continue to get more. We'll certainly continue to update that so that you have a one-stop shop, as well as certainly talking to any of your local sales representatives. But this is also a great resource opportunity for information. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Scott to kind of help coordinate some of the questions And this just again is a reminder as we're looking at the screen of some of the other sources that you have above and beyond what we're covering today.
Yeah, that was a great presentation, Scott. I really learned a lot. Every time I think about this issue, I'm reminded of what a big issue it is. It is probably the biggest thing to hit the industry since VGB or maybe before. And I did want to quickly remind everyone that we will have another webinar coming later this year in November, and we'll be able to let you know about that in the same way that we let you know about this one. But stay alert for that, and that'll be, there may be changes before then, or there may be new information to update you on, or we'll just be a lot closer to the date. And now we'll get to some questions. I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm writing a story, or I just finished it, and it's going to come out next week in our April issue about selling the benefits of these pumps, especially to single speed pump owners who may be skeptical. And you had a great slide there that demonstrated that, but you also mentioned the quiet operation, and that can be a huge selling point according to all the people that I talk to across the country who are doing that now. And one of the things that they mentioned is that often a single speed pump owner thinks that they know how loud a pool pump is, and they don't really believe how quiet a variable speed pump running at 1750 or 1200 RPM really is, and what a difference that can make to them. So it's important not to quickly go over that point, but to really drive that home, that most single speed customers, especially if their pump has gotten a little rusty or started to whine a little bit, don't understand how much quieter these pumps are and what a difference that can make in their life. If their bedroom is located near the equipment pad or something, this can be a huge thing for them. So I just kind of wanted to bring up that point.
Absolutely, it's significant, and I can't think of a better word to say that in terms of the operation, the quiet operation at lower speeds. So it's right up there with the energy savings and opportunities.
Okay, we'll start with some questions. First one is, what do I need to know about WEF or WEF? What do I need to know about that?
Ultimately, the miles per gallon, I think, is probably the best analogy. I think we've all been, conditioned over our, through experiences that think about miles per gallon as one factor. It's still not the only factor when deciding in buying a vehicle. It goes back to my earlier comment. You still got to size the pump for the application. Generally speaking, the smaller the pump, the higher the weighted energy factor. So it is a way to compare the energy efficiency, and all things equal, a higher WEF will be more efficient. But in some cases, you may still need to put a product with a lower WEF because you still need the flow. You may need to put a 3 horsepower variable speed pump because you need a lot of flow. And that WEF, because it's variable speed, is going to be a lot higher than any single speed. But you still, as a pool professional, have to make that decision about what is the right pump size for the application. And then ultimately, you or the consumer can say, within that size range, what are some options that you might have? And WEF is a way to ultimately compare that in the same way. And just like miles per gallon, it's based off a standard way. You how you use it is up to you. You can buy a variable speed pump and run it on full speed the entire time. Wouldn't really recommend that, but you could. Just like you could buy a hybrid and drive the heck out of it. It doesn't mean you're always going to get those miles per gallon, but under standard conditions you will. So the WEF is basically a standard way to compare the efficiency, very, very similar to miles per gallon.
Excellent. How will this affect warranties or aftermarket replacement parts for non-compliant pumps?
glad you asked. That's probably the second most common question after replacement motors, and they kind of go hand in hand. So, the motor is probably the most commonly replaced item on a single speed pump. And so, what happens for warranty? Well, until the motor regulation goes through, not much changes because we can still provide those single speed motors for warranty. But again, on the expectation that motor regulation does go through, then it's really a matter of what product will the manufacturer be able to provide. The warranty, to be crystal clear, the warranties will be covered. Speaking for Hayward, we will cover it. So if you sold a product on June of 2021 and it's got up to a 3-year warranty, it will be covered, and we will provide with whatever we have available. If we have single speed motors that were made before the date of the motor regulation, we can provide that. But anything after that date, if we don't have it, we would, presumably have to provide a product that does comply, like a variable speed. So the customers, you and your customers, will be covered under warranty. It's ultimately on the manufacturer's responsibility in terms of what to provide based off, what's still available on our shelves.
Okay, we're crossing the 1 hour mark, and science tells us that most human beings start to lose focus after a while. So we'll get down to we'll pick out 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. I heard all single speed pumps will no longer be compliant. Is that not true?
No, and again, it's probably common, and because of other regulations where that it's been a little, kind of almost the net impact of that most single speeds go away. That is not the case here. There still will be some single speed pumps, but it depends on where you are in the country or what types of pumps you use, I should say. For Hayward, we'll still be able to make 1 horsepower super pumps in smaller, 1 horsepower max flow XL and smaller. And those are going to work in a lot of applications, but in applications where you might need more performance, larger plumbing, you may have less options. So the short answer is there still will be single speed pumps, but it's going to vary depending on each model. And so look to see a list of the specific Hayward models, single speed and variable speed, that will meet the requirement.
Gotcha. Okay, last question, Scott, and again, this is really informative. How will this impact pumps sold outside the U.S.?
While this regulation is for pumps sold into the U.S. and therefore doesn't directly impact international, kind of by association it will, in that as manufacturers, pump manufacturers, motor manufacturers, if we're not able to make as many products for the U.S., we may have to look at its impact on international. But then also, just from a practical standpoint, we could still make, for instance, a 1.5 horsepower super pump for sale outside the U.S. And some U.S. distributors might distribute to areas across the border. So there's criteria in the regulation in terms of we have to clearly label those products as not for sale in the United States. So I guess a long-winded way of saying that this regulation, while not explicitly impacting international, will have direct and indirect impact on international as it relates to how we label and perhaps to some degree what products we are ultimately able to offer.
Gotcha. Okay, that was great. Thanks very much, Scott. I want to thank everyone for coming today, and I hope to see you all back here in November when we tie into this issue once again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody, for joining.